So myself and my supervisor kind of had this idea that what if our ability to perform kind of exists on like a continuum? So at one end of the spectrum, we've got performance conflict, which was the umbrella term that we decided to create to kind of include the different terminology that different sports have for the phenomena. So got like the yips, which is what they call it in like golf, lost move syndrome, what we call it, mental blocks, target panic, which I believe they call it in archery, and dartitis, which I think that's a really quite a fun name for it, but that's from darts, obviously. But basically, even though different sports like might show itself slightly different physically, the psychological experience is kind of shared and very common between the different sports. So that's why we came up with the umbrella term. But basically what it means when our desired or intended movements are not achieved. So that can be that it results in like tremors or jerks, tension, freezing, an inability to perform a previously well-established skill, or unintentionally performing the wrong skill or adding additional twists. So yeah, lost move syndrome, mental blocks, the yips, things like that, all in this end of the spectrum. So kind of a bit of a like negative side of the spectrum. Sometimes people can get stuck in a bit of a vicious cycle. But then we like the idea of that there being kind of hope and opportunity and potential to move to an opposite side of the spectrum. And yeah, that is what we represented by the umbrella term performance harmony. So that kind of includes like flow state, clutch state, and peak performance. So where your movements are executed exactly as intended or potentially even better than intended. And that kind of shows itself in the form of like optimal performance experience, automaticity, or even superior execution of movements. So yeah, I hope that all makes sense so far. But yeah, we like the idea of that someone doesn't have to be stuck and that there's the potential for them to move to the other side as well. So yeah, the kind of hope that comes from it, hopefully. Okay. So yeah, from my systematic reviews, kind of found that there's a lot of different variables that can influence the kind of onset or maintenance of performance conflict. And some of the ones I'm going to talk about tonight are individual differences, emotions, thoughts and cognitions, and significant life events. And at the end of each one of these, I'll kind of pause in case anyone's got any questions as we go through as well. And in case Ian or Jay, if you want to add anything as well. And yeah, there's also potential like, neurological factors which could be involved in performance conflict, but I didn't include them in this review because there's absolutely no research on it in terms of gymnastics. There's a little bit in golf, but I guess this is mostly due to like the difficulty of measuring it. You know, like if you were to put a cap on someone to measure their brain function, it's quite challenging in the gymnastics world when people are doing somersaults, for example. So yeah, I haven't included it in this. It's also really complicated as well. So yeah, I think we just don't know enough about it at this kind of point in time. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to talk about is personality and then specifically kind of perfectionism as well. So yeah, this, as I said before, like so far, there's been kind of surprisingly little research on how an athlete's personality might impact like performance conflict. For example, one study found that athletes who had experienced performance conflict had lower levels of conscientiousness, which could potentially suggest that athletes who kind of refrain from acting within social norms are more likely to take risks, are less careful, and could be more likely to experience performance conflict. But in my study, I found that athletes who had experienced performance conflict had lower levels of emotional stability and lower levels of extroversion than athletes who hadn't had that experience. So yeah, lower levels of emotional stability, like being easily upset, anxious, easily stressed, and could increase the likelihood of experiencing events as like significant or emotionally significant. And lower levels of extroversion, so lacking self-confidence, being more reserved, shy, less assertive, and more likely to think that your anxiety is like detrimental to performance. So debilitative, for example. So yeah, when I got those results, I was kind of like, well, to me, that makes sense. Because that low emotional stability and low extroversion could increase athletes' perceptions of like expectations from others to perform. And they could also have like a lack of inability to cope with challenges and potentially threatening situations, not want to let others down, and have an unwillingness to discuss their feelings with their coaches, for example.
Yeah, in my experience, there've been a mixture of all of those, and that word perfectionism, perfectionist, yes, they may theoretically want everything to be perfect, but when it's not quite perfect, that's when they can dip, and a training session can be gone because something hasn't quite gone right. And it doesn't matter how much you say it's okay, don't be afraid to fail, it's okay to make mistakes. Once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads me really nicely into my next slide, which is actually talking a bit more detail about that perfectionism. So yeah, I think in sport, perfectionism is actually often a trait which is kind of celebrated, or people are, oh, like they're such a perfectionist, that's why they get to where they're at. And it's like a really common trait within, especially high performing athletes and even high performing coaches as well. And so I think it's really important to actually understand exactly what perfectionism is. So yeah, we kind of look at the two different parts of perfectionism. So we've got perfectionistic striving, which is having like high personal standards, being highly organized and striving for perfectionism. So this part in itself can be okay. It's got some links to improving performance and doesn't necessarily have negative impacts on gymnasts or athletes in general. But the other part of perfectionism, perfectionistic concern, this is where some of the more kind of difficulties could potentially lie. So that's concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, parental criticism, parental expectations. So those two kind of particularly for younger gymnasts. Non-display of imperfectionism and perfectionistic self-promotion. So that's kind of like that fear of failure, not wanting anyone to see anything but that perfect side of them, basically. And it's when this part in itself has been shown to have like negative effects on people such as like burnout, depression, anxiety, and doesn't necessarily have any links with improved performance. But yeah, it's when you have the combination of like high perfectionistic striving and high perfectionistic concern, those two together kind of makes unhealthy perfectionism. And it's that's been shown to be higher in athletes who've experienced performance conflicts than athletes who haven't. So yeah, exactly as nicely illustrated by Ian there as well. But yeah, I'm just going to pause for a little second and check if anyone's got any questions at this point about any kind of personality or any like experience you want to share either as well about any kind of personality characteristics you've maybe noticed.
Can I ask a question? This like just obviously studies has been done on growth mindset and fixed mindset, and I just wonder when you were talking about high perfectionistic striving, that sounded like it was kind of more like someone with a growth mindset would display. So does that kind of study correlate the sort of growth mindset against fixed mindset, where when you described it, the high perfectionistic concern, the person who carries doubts about the action, worried about mistake, afraid of making mistakes and all that, that sounds like someone who's very much a bit like fixed mindset and won't try things because of that fear of failure. Is that correlate with those two studies, or is there anything being done at all on that? Or
yeah, I haven't seen like explicitly said in terms of like growth mindset and stuff in relation to this, but I would say yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, exactly the way that you explained it. Almost that perfectionistic concern, like that fear of failure can kind of stop people from kind of taking on challenges as well, because they kind of think, well, I don't want to be shown to fail at stuff. And yeah, like Ian said as well about kind of as coaches, I guess like something we can try and do to help is create that environment where it's okay to fail, and it's like having that perception of what can you learn from failure? What does it teach you? Like, how does it help you move forwards? I mean, easier said than done, like Ian said, regardless of how many times you say that, some gymnasts like might not be able to move out with that headspace. But yeah, as much as we can as coaches, creating that environment, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think as well, it's what is a perception of failure. We try to encourage them, not be afraid to fail, obviously in a safe manner, what have you. But I just wonder, it seems to be becoming increasingly more common, sort of the whole positive parenting at home. So, it's only positive words. And then within our coaching, if we spot an error, then we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't point out that error. And then it's that resilience, I guess, to cope with an error being pointed out. And that can be really difficult. And again, it's something that I've experienced where, you think you're just doing your normal day-to-day coaching, pointing out an error, then it comes back, they took it as a real personal criticism because, as you find out down the line, they're only used to positive parenting at home. And, I'm not saying that leads to lost move syndrome, but it relates back to perfectionism and the disruption of a training session, because in your day-to-day you've just said, no, that's not quite right, you need to do this, or lift an arm here, but it's taken as a real personal attack. And I just wonder, if the sort of social family situation can also lead to this, as well as us as coaches, as well as them as gymnasts, and also growth spurts.
Yeah, I remember we spoke about this last time as well, Ian, the impact of like the kind of home environment. And yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's no kind of like literature that like shows like the answer to that. But yeah, I think I would agree with you in terms of like people who kind of are less resilient or who don't have to kind of problem solve in their everyday life or kind of deal with challenges, that they then kind of perceive that they've not got the ability to cope with challenges when they're in a challenging situation in the gym, for example. And sport is full of challenges as well. So yeah, I think that kind of like problem solving ability is really important. And I suppose as coaches, like even doing things like sitting and going, okay, let's like run through different scenarios. What would happen if this scenario happened? Like, how would you all kind of problem solve and deal with it? But yeah, I think that like that's such an interesting insight for sure. Any other wee points, or are we happy for me to move on? Okay, so the next I'm going to touch on is emotions. So the emotional state of an athlete can affect the prioritization of task relevant information. So for example, like worry, anxiety can lead to like a more conscious effort to control and attend to movements in an attempt to ensure success. However, the result of trying to control those movements can often result in detrimental kind of like performance, lost move syndrome, like we were saying, particularly for well-learned skills. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit more detail slightly later on. But yeah, that attempt to ensure success, like trying to control movements that are well-learned. So yeah, research conducted with interviewing athletes has illustrated like the emotional burden that is experienced when going through performance conflict. So some of the commonly occurring emotions that have been highlighted are things like feeling destroyed, shocked, embarrassed, vulnerable, angry, frustrated, helpless, and isolated as well, due to the lack of understanding of the experience, both by like the athlete or gymnast and from others around them. So yeah, some quite powerful emotions like experienced in actually going through that experience. And in my first year study, I tested pre-competitive emotions and found that athletes who had experienced performance conflict had higher levels of dejection, anxiety, somatic anxiety, so like the bodily felt anxiety, worry, and concentration disruption than athletes who had not had that experience. And yeah, feeling dejected prior to competition might be as a result of the lost move syndrome because they've got a perceived inability to perform. They could feel like totally helpless. And the unpredictability as well of the performance conflict symptoms as well could also cause that. And yeah, focus on negative thoughts and experiences, which again, I'm going to come back to again in a little second. And yeah, and in terms of anxiety, the research on the relationship between anxiety and performance conflict suggests that anxiety may not cause the experience, but may exacerbate or worsen the symptoms. So recently, higher levels of social anxiety were shown in athletes with performance conflict, which could be perhaps explained by the visible nature of the symptoms, or potentially, like we were saying before, about that perfectionism, like not wanting to show anything but perfectionism. And yeah, increases in state anxiety, so environmentally situated anxiety, can result in the failure of explicitly and implicitly learned motor skills. So those muscle memory and the new skills as well. Athletes could also deliberately stop themselves from doing a skill in an attempt to avoid an associated fear, and that in itself can actually lead to the skill loss. And again, athletes' perception of the problem can induce anxiety, which results in the over-control, causing the conflict in performance, which worsens the perception of the problem. So intensifying the process, which can often result in this vicious cycle that athletes can get stuck in. And the nature of that vicious cycle could explain the often lengthy duration of the performance conflict. So yeah, they can get a little bit stuck, like we were saying, at that performance conflict end of the continuum. It can be easy for athletes to get stuck in that. So yeah, any comments or thoughts about emotions in regard to performance conflict or lost move syndrome?
Is there any common ground of where within a training or competition cycle that this type of behavior can be prevalent?
Yep. I think I'll mention it in a little minute as well, but yeah, changes in environment. So that can even be something like moving up to a new level. And again, I think it's like we're saying about that skill challenge kind of perception, whether they believe they've got the skills necessary to meet the challenge. So things like, yeah, changes of environment, competition coming up, like high pressured situations coming up, changes in level, I guess even like considering acro, potentially even changes in partnership, changes in coaches. Yeah, changes in environment can trigger those sort of emotions.
I was thinking more in terms of the timing. Again, in my experience, it happened twice, same person, but twice. Training leading up to a trial, great, 8 weeks out, 2 weeks before, problems occurred. Managed to get them through, gotten through the trial, got selected, training for European Championships, 8 weeks out, great, no problems. 2 weeks before, completely went. And had to withdraw them because it just and it seemed to me, obviously, the more real the competition became and the closer it came to the competition, higher levels of tension, anxiety, arousal, etc., etc. You know, starting to overthink.
Yeah.
You know, and that seemed to be very common with this gymnast in particular. Super talented, you know, big skills, not a problem learning, not a problem executing them. But then competition preparation, the closer the competition became, the more the issues became prevalent.
Yeah, and I suppose any kind of situation or any kind of stimuli that the gymnast perceives as a threat. So yeah, I suppose it would make total sense in the lead up to a competition, or could it even potentially be returning to the same kind of venue that they made a mistake in before as well, could be enough to be perceived as a threatening kind of environment or situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just wondered if that seemed to be common in terms of other gymnasts or athletes where the performance conflict first raised its head.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously 8 weeks out, the lower stress levels, you know, training's good, relaxed, quite enjoyable. As it gets closer, tensions rise. And I just wondered if that was common across other cases of you know, this situation.
Mm-hmm. I think just from my personal experience of working like in a coaching capacity with that gymnast I mentioned before, for her, yeah, I think it was like you said before, like spring series, before a big competition. Even she showed up one time at a competition and couldn't do a skill that had not been a problem before.
Mm-hmm.
But there were other times in training when it wasn't necessarily like close to a competition, when it would randomly happen as well. And I suppose like for potentially with younger people, maybe what's going on in their school life pressure wise as well could potentially play a part. And I've worked with a rower actually that had, you know, like what he described as the yips. And yeah, for him, it was around kind of selection for GB squads time that the experience had started for him. So yeah, I do wonder, I don't know for sure, but yeah, I'm sure that it could be like a common theme for a lot of people.
Yeah, because you know, just going back to the Olympics, and Simone Biles got the twisties, as they called it. Just wondered when they, you know, when she first felt that, whether that was leading up to the biggest competition. You know, if it is a stress and tension of performing on the big stage for everybody, if that becomes a little bit overwhelming, something takes over. And
I wonder as well, guys, if that the sort of the competition pressure and stress that you're both talking about, if age plays a factor in that. I mean, in many cases in gymnastics, we're talking about very, very young people who are not supposed to be equipped psychologically, mentally to deal with, you know, high levels of stress and stuff, and yet they are exposed through high level of stress and pressure in those high performance competitive environments. So
yeah,
does that obviously kind of play a factor as well?
Yeah, and I think I would assume as well, I think I meant, yeah, the social anxiety that I've got up there, that, yeah, if people do have social anxiety, then being in a situation where they're being, you know, judged, watched by an audience, watched by selectors, that, yeah, that's bound to kind of, like you said, raise pressures, or that kind of perfectionism, or, you know, fear of failure, things like that. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about significant life events in a little second and come back to my thoughts on Simone Biles when I talk about that. So remind me if I forget, Ian. But yeah. It's a good point. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to move on now to thoughts and cognitions. So I'm going to talk about skill acquisition, reinvestment, and rumination. So we'll explain all of these as we go on. So yeah, for skill acquisition, so as we learn any kind of skill, the amount of attentional focus and conscious processing required on the skill gradually reduces until the skill becomes like automatic or muscle memory. So if the reduction of that attention is too fast, so if a skill is learned too quickly or rushed, then the athlete may not have kind of built that solid base of learning, which could cause skill loss if an athlete is experiencing like a debilitative thoughts or emotions, or a significant life event, or even a high pressured situation, exactly what we were talking about. So if someone doesn't have that kind of solid base of learning, that could trigger the kind of loss of the skill. And the same effect can be caused by slow and difficult skill acquisition. So don't mean slow in terms of like you've really taken your time working the preps. It means slow in terms of the athlete has kind of struggled to understand the skill, or really struggled, or it's kind of been a slow process for them to be able to kind of comprehend it or learn it. And yeah, it's possible that when athletes are experiencing performance conflict, they are temporarily unable to access automatic motor information and instead attempt to consciously attend and process the movement. So almost like they're short-circuiting, basically, their ability to tap into that automatic motor information. So yes, similar to that, reinvestment is what we call the conscious attempt to control movement during skill execution, which can be harmful, particularly for well-learned skills which have become automatic, so those muscle memory skills. Reinvestment can be caused by pressure situations, so what we were saying earlier, significant life events, or when adapting to any kind of new environment, so moving to a higher level, competition, any kind of new environment. And competition or training preparation could cause the athlete to switch from performance-enhancing thoughts to negative ones, which can increase overthinking, perceptions of inadequacy, anxiety, fear of failure, and that can activate something which we call ironic processing. So ironic processing is where, in attempting to prevent or remove a negative thought or image, it actually has the opposite effect. And the more we try and stop thinking or stop trying to do something, the more likely we are to remain stuck on what we're trying to avoid. So yeah, ironic. And athletes may also reinvest in an attempt to control their performance conflicts as symptoms. So if they already have performance conflict, they might try and reinvest to try and stop the symptoms happening, which again, may actually have the opposite effect and increase the likelihood of those symptoms occurring. So like I said before, kind of getting people stuck in that vicious cycle. So that's everything on reinvestment. Cool. Sometimes my mouse disappears. I think my computer is giving up on me. And then, yeah, rumination. So rumination is the unintentionally recurring conscious thoughts, memories, and or images revolving around the causes, consequences, and symptoms of any significant emotional experience. So rather than processing the traumatic experience, rumination focuses on the why and what if questions. And athletes with performance conflict have been shown to have higher levels of rumination than athletes who haven't had that experience. And then again, this focus on the symptoms of performance conflict could actually increase the chances of performance conflict reoccurring. So yeah, any thoughts on this part of it? Well, actually, I'm going to do one more and then come to the thoughts. So yeah, just following on from there in terms of significant life events, a growing number of researchers have recently indicated that traumatic events could lead to the onset of performance conflict, even if the trauma has been experienced years before the onset of performance conflict. So it's suggested that basically when we experience a kind of significant emotional experience, and we'll all have like a different kind of perception of what that significant emotional experience is. So for me, that might be totally different to what someone else might experience it to be. But when we experience situations like that, the emotions are too intense to be processed into our working memory, and so are instead kind of stored in raw sensory and emotional information. So basically kind of become trapped in the body. And that kind of trapped emotions in the body can sometimes be converted to physical symptoms as a defense mechanism. So any kind of threatening situation that has stimuli even remotely similar to the traumatic event can result in the emotions from the original trauma being reactivated, which can result in the freezing, jerks, or spasms, or inability to perform a skill, or extra twists. And significant life events could be experienced both in and out of the sporting context as well. So you might think it's something totally irrelevant, but it could be that's causing those emotions to be trapped. And yeah, experiencing performance conflict could in itself be considered a significant emotional event. So again, we can see how there's a bit of an unfortunate negative cycle. And yeah, I'll kind of mention what my thoughts on Simone Biles were just now. I had kind of thought during her experience, I guess, going to the Olympics, being in that high pressured event, even if you think about Simone Biles and the trauma she's experienced, if you think about, all the athlete A stuff, and yeah, returning back to that environment after going through that experience, for me, I felt like, there must be a link, because obviously even the former coaches and stuff that had all been a part of the previous Olympic cycle. So yeah, for me, I wondered if that was all a part of it as well, like the kind of traumatic emotions kind of being resurfaced.
And do you think expectation as well?
Yep. Definitely perceived pressure from others to perform, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone wants to kind of jump in at this point or anything at all that you want to add.
In terms of warning signs, is there anything common? You fidgety, just acting a little bit out of character.
Yeah, I suppose a part of it comes down to having that relationship with your gymnasts and knowing, kind of noticing, like you said, when they come in and they're not quite seeming themselves, and hopefully being able to have that open dialogue with them where they can tell you, like, today's not been good, or this is what's going on for me outside of gym, or even noticing if they're struggling to cope with something difficult that's happened in training. So yeah, I guess like a big part of us as coaches, surrogate parent role almost, like being able to kind of notice those kind of differences in when people are changing. And I think we spoke about last time the potential of going through puberty being a significant life event as well. And there's no research on it. In fact, there's very little research on kind of youth athletes that have had this experience. But yeah, I think I would say that that's got to count as a potential significant life event, just going through the changes in the body. Like we said, how that could interrupt like muscle memory movement from the body being different. And also kind of, people are socially anxious, like being really aware of how their body looks to other people and stuff like that as well. So yeah, I would say that could definitely count as a significant life event as well.
And what sort of early interventions would you suggest? Obviously as coaches, you've talked about not taking any shortcuts in coaching skills. That's what we can control as coaches. But in my experience, when it comes to this side of things, it needs an outside intervention, and the earlier the better, because once it's gone, it can be a long road to regain a skill or whatever, overcome that hurdle.
Yeah, I think particularly if you have noticed that it could be in relation to a significant life event, I would definitely suggest, either seeking like a sports psychologist that has like therapeutic training, or even like a therapist that will work specifically through that trauma to kind of make sure those emotions are properly processed. And then potentially also then having like this psychological support on top of that for like psychological skills training. But I think not forgetting about having the trauma part of it and having help with that to be processed properly, I think is really important. And at the end as well, I'm going to speak about a couple of things that I've read recently that could potentially be like little helping things as well. But yeah, I would definitely say to seek support, like you said, because as coaches, there's only so much we can do. And also not forgetting that as coaches, we have to look after ourselves as well.
Yeah. And I do think it's increasingly important as clubs to have a link with that psychological support. So, develop a link so that there's somebody close by or online that we can tap into, if not regularly, when needs must, on a needs basis. I think it's becoming increasingly prevalent that's such an important factor in sporting performance now.
And like you said as well, hopefully the more people use sports psychologists or have that support available, hopefully the more open and willing people will become to kind of talking about their experiences, or being able to feel like they can share their emotions with people as well. Because yeah, for some people there is still a bit of a stigma around it as well. And I guess, like we were saying before, in terms of like problem solving, even, it's kind of viewing it as like, you don't need to have a problem to see a sports psychologist. You can do it because you want to kind of maintain your peak performance level, or, you know, like you're just problem solving for anything that could come up. So yeah, hopefully, like you said, people are kind of starting to use sports psychologists more, and it's becoming a more kind of widespread thing, even like footballers saying they've got them and stuff like that. So yeah, hopefully that support becomes more readily available as well, because I know it can be not always like accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
Ian, I've got a question for you. Actually, just before you move on, obviously you've experienced success at a high level, and I'm sure along that journey to get to that, you know, level of success, you've experienced also drawbacks and challenges with your athletes and gymnasts. And you're obviously quite knowledgeable in the area of, you know, lost move. I know you've done a bit of work on it when you've spoken about it and stuff. So when you're actually working with a gymnast on lost move, and you can sense there's something there because you've got a relationship with them, right? Yeah. You've spent time, you've invested your time in building a relationship with them, and you know, it's almost like you know before they know that there's an issue developing. How do you, as a coach, get them to open up about it and raise their level of awareness? Because, you know, you get taught as an athlete, well, as humans in general, no, I'm fine. Even when you have that close relationship with somebody, are you okay? No, I'm fine. You know, no problem. You almost get that built into you, don't you? So just wondering from your point of view, how you raise that level of awareness with them.
I think it manifests itself in sort of stressful reactions. You know, like I say, noticing you know, a fidget, you know, or even, you know, they can. It's not self-harming, but you can see the you know, the quite forceful, or, you know, rubbing their wrist, or, you know, and just recognizing out of character traits, and generally taking them out of that situation, i.e. the training gym, the hall, and even bringing the parent in and just sitting down and, what's up? I can tell you're not acting the way you normally would. You don't seem your normal self. And because, like you say, we're dealing with youngsters, they will generally, you know, break down, if you like, have a cry, because the tension become too much. They have a cry, they let that anxiety go, and then you can start to talk to them about, it's okay. We don't expect everything perfect every time. But in the training hall, you know, we're going back to perfectionists. They want everything to be perfect, even when they're learning. You know, they want every attempt to go up and rotate 3 times and land stood up when, you know, when they're in the early learning phase of it. And just sometimes that tension builds up, and especially I think in acro, in that it's in my experience, the top who experiences that. And if you've got an 11, 12, 13-year-old top, they're generally working with a 17, 18, 19-year-old base or bases. So there's not a lot of common ground there to talk to each other, you know, to say, I'm struggling here a little bit, because the base or bases will have their own interests. There's no common ground other than gymnastics with them. So until you sort of bring them out of that situation and try and talk them down a little bit and encourage them to express how they're feeling, which can result in a few tears. Once they've got that out the system, then they can start to say, I feel like I'm struggling with that skill. And then you can say, but it's okay, we're just learning it. Don't expect it perfect. It's in the belt, it's safe. Just, you know, as coaches, we're trying not to cut any corners and teach things as they should be taught. So that an interesting theory that I heard was lost move syndrome is a move that's never been found in the first place if you've cut corners teaching it. So going back to, we can only do so much as a coach. We can teach skills as best we can with the right techniques, with the right preparations and progressions. Then when you can see a gymnast becoming stressed out and acting a bit out of character, then you can start to put little strategies in place to help them cope with that and try to get to the root of the problem.
So John's got his hand up. I think he wants to come in with something.
Yes, thanks, Jay. Thanks. It was just maybe just to Charlotte. Going back to the slide about emotions or anxiety, I just wondered whether she thought the characteristics that she displayed there, whether they'd be commonly associated with other disorders like, like ADHD or ADD or like autism, so it's like neurodivergences. I just wondered if she had much to say on that, really.
Very interesting question. I haven't read anything on it. Like, unfortunately, this kind of area of research is still pretty new. So there, like a lot of the research is still in like golf, and so yeah, I've not read anything in terms of like comorbidity with other like neurological differences or other things, but potentially, I guess, even if we consider that like skill learning, whether people learn skills differently to how everyone else might learn skills, for example, and that could cause like the improper learning of the skill without us even meaning to, or we might have done everything right and that it's just not quite how that person's brain has kind of learned the skill, for example. So yeah, I guess like it would make sense, but yeah.
It was also the sort of you're talking about traumatic events and so forth, how if they maybe were like undiagnosed with these disorders, because they might be like, I don't want to use the word normal, but if they're borderline not showing any of these characteristics, how you hear people at the age of like mid-30s becoming diagnosed with something because for their entire life they just may have been just maybe thought of as being a little bit unusual, but just having the odd characteristic. And I just wonder whether there was like multiple triggers to the occurrence of a lost move, like rather than sort of just one trait, if you know what I mean. So that was the other thing I was interested just when Ian mentioned about fidgeting, because I know like in when people get like when they need sensory arousing, they'll start rubbing themselves or doing things like or little ticks, and again I just wondered whether that was that stressing was like the prompt to that sensory arousal, the need to arouse themselves in other ways to almost divert the stress from the environment they were in. I'll stop talking.
No, your questions are really interesting questions. So yeah, thank you very much. One of my colleagues on my course is actually a neurodivergent like psychologist, so I'm actually like now really interested to go and ask her what her thoughts on this would be. And yeah, in terms of does anyone experience just one of these things or many, it could be that they have like a high tolerance, they could experience many of these things and then eventually one thing will tip it over the edge, or they could experience all of this and never experience performance conflicts, or it could be just one thing. So yeah, I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it could be everything or nothing, basically.
I think, because I was amazed when my own children started school, how many of the children in high school were identified as having additional needs, so I think it was something like 50%. And when I first heard that, I thought, wow, that's a massive figure. So I took that as then, well, in theory, maybe that's 50% of gymnasts may have an additional need that the coaches don't know about, or maybe the parents haven't mentioned or recognized, or because sometimes there's not really a correlation between what the school tell parents either, so they may be doing things for the child, but the parent may be oblivious to that, so it was just how that had a knock-on effect then to the gymnastic environment, because obviously gymnastics is very physical teaching, but I don't think there's really too much I'm going to speak out of turn here. There's maybe not too much education of some coaches in more the emotional training or the sort of mental training to do with things, you know. So, anyway, I've just waffled again. Sorry, I'm going to shut up at this point. Sorry.
No, please don't apologize. Honestly, you're raising really valuable points, and I think like
relevant, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think as well shows. I think it's amazing that as a coach you're thinking about that stuff, because like you said, it's not necessarily something that we get taught on coaching courses, or you know, like even for a lot of my course that we get taught about. So yeah, the fact that you're even kind of considering that there could be additional things going on for your gymnast, I think is amazing. So yeah, no, thank you for your comments. And you know, I just wanted to pick up on something you said as well. I thought it was really interesting that you were mentioning about the tops being quite isolated, and that feeling of being isolated was something that had been found with the emotions that had been looked into. So, but yeah, well, yeah, I'll get back on track.
I think just going back to John's point about not just being one trait, in my experience, the gymnast, you know, was a product of positive parenting, was a perfectionist, had a bit of probably OCD, came in and folded the clothes very neatly where some will just throw them into the corner, was very socially a little bit awkward, had problems at school, forming relationships with the peers, moved school as a result. So all of those things combined ended up creating, unfortunately, a very stressful child gymnast. So there wasn't sort of one thing, there was any number of things that we've talked about there that altogether may have contributed, or one thing may have contributed, or a couple of combinations of that may have contributed, but it was literally to the point where there was just an inability to jump, from doing real high level skills to not being able to jump, full stop. And you know, once it got to that point, it was the point of no return. And then a couple of years down the line, changed partnerships, and it's the same one that I'm talking about. Got 2 weeks before trial, lost it, managed to get it back gently because we'd had a bit of experience of it. But then from selection to Europeans wasn't a great deal of time. 2 weeks before Europeans it went, and obviously at that point, 2 weeks before competition, there wasn't enough time to miss training, to bring somebody in to deal with the situation. So it, you know, was a real unfortunate situation. And maybe the first situation was that traumatic life event that affected the next ones, you know, a bit of a chain reaction.
Yeah. It's it's heartbreaking for them, really, isn't it? It's such a difficult experience.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I suppose after talking about the heartbreak, that there are some potential benefits from going through this experience. So actually overcoming the experience of performance conflict has got the potential to be an important aspect in the psychological growth of an athlete. So some athletes that had overcome performance conflict had higher levels of like psychological maturity, self-understanding, independent achievement orientation, and clear meaning of their sports activity than athletes who had never experienced performance conflict. So there is that opportunity for psychological growth that comes out of it. I guess, like, just thinking about your athlete there, Ian, I wonder if age and maturity plays a part on that as well.
Well, yeah, I think immaturity in relation to the age, a very, very immature 12, 13-year-old, and perhaps hadn't spoke to the parents, sheltered them from life, normal life, you know, realism, and wanted to keep them as young as possible for as long as possible. And there's I've not got a criticism there, but it meant that there wasn't that level of maturity and resilience that would come back to deal with a negative situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ian.
Sorry, Charlotte, going back to that, you said there was greater incidence of psychological maturity.
Yeah, so they had higher levels of psychological maturity than people that hadn't had that experience.
Right. Was the research also looking at whether some of that group had lower levels of psychological maturity? So obviously some had more. Was there anything where there was like a balance in that?
I think that, from what I can remember, I think they just looked at means, and I think they had 3 groups. So I think they had a group that had never experienced performance conflict, they had a group that were still experiencing it, and a group that had overcome it. And so yeah, they just did the means rather than the means of like the overall mean of each group, rather than any opposite effect, I suppose. So yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, I'm afraid.
No, it's okay, because what I think really interesting, given that we think there's like multiple causes, whether people identified with different causes would have actually the similar effect. Like, does that make sense? Yeah. So it might be that a certain group might be psychologically more mature, but let's say the group who'd had a traumatic life experience, they may be the group who had actually less psychological maturity. So I was just interested in your comment. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. Again, thanks for raising that. And as soon as you said that, I thought like about the significant life events too. And I was thinking, I guess, like if someone hasn't gone and properly processed that experience still, then it still has the potential to trigger those emotions. So yeah, absolutely. I wonder if the different potential variables that have played a part could influence the likelihood of someone having it again, or the likelihood of someone feeling like they've completely overcome the experience. Yeah.
Nikki, you've got your hand up. You want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I'll probably stutter all the way through. So you mentioned that the study kind of took in those that were still having issues, those that had overcome them.
Mm-hmm.
Did it look at those that never overcome them? I'm just wondering, though, that reoccurring thing, if they're never overcoming it, then that's going to affect that part of the maturity is not obviously been tackled and not developed, purely because we have a few gymnasts that have reoccurring issues, even with external intervention and trying to work through it. And I'm really interested to figure out how we break the cycle. But also looking at what you've said so far, for me, it doesn't matter what the trigger is. It can just be that one extra bit of stress that they're not used to coping with. It can be something really tiny. But for me, I just think as humans, we're very, in our situation, it tends to be backward moving skills that just disappear off the face of the earth. And to me, at least with a backward skill, I can kind of see where I'm landing, where a forward skill, I don't see the landing till I've hit it. So I find it really interesting that as human beings, we're very forward facing. When we do preschool stuff, a lot of the stuff's crawling through the tunnel forward. The gymnast with that little bit of stress, their body and mind reverts back to what they feel safe and comfortable with. And it tends to be things that they've learnt between, the age of 0 and 5. When they've really learnt something for the first time, that's an embedded natural trait. And that slightest bit of stress puts the switch off. And as human beings, we don't do enough to learn, and I know what you're saying with is it acro? When do you challenge a 5-year-old to be way up at that height? Normally you're going, oh, get down from there, you're going to hurt yourself. All that embedded traits is something as coaches we have no control over.
Yeah.
How do we get that into our gymnasts so that they have got something to fall back on, because you're always going to have that vicious cycle. It's an embedded trait now, and we've had very little success even with external input to break the cycle completely.
Yeah, because we are designed to stay in balance, aren't we? We're not designed to fall over backwards. So I don't know, Charlotte, you'll be able to say more on it, but can we break the cycle if it's there? And in my case, probably that initial incident became a major life incident, which led to to more further down the line. Is it always there? Can it be broken? Early intervention could that help if we can recognize signs early?
Yeah, I think well, the honest answer is that I don't know. But no, thank you so much as well, all of you, for your insight and your points, because yeah, you've got me thinking about so much more stuff that I want to like go and look at and try and find out about. And I hadn't even thought about the fact of, you know, like our whole developmental process. Like you said, everything we do, we move, you know, like forwards. And when we feel under threat, do we revert back to, you know, like what we've learned throughout our whole life in terms of those like safe motor skills? Yeah, such an interesting perspective that, like I said, I hadn't actually considered something like that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, the honest answer is I don't know. There is some research that suggests, well, yeah, the research that has actually done intervention studies with athletes is very, very little. There's a handful of studies that have done interventions with athletes, and I guess like the people that publish their studies are probably people that had successful interventions as well, because people don't tend to enjoy publishing results that say, oh, like my intervention didn't work. So I guess that there is the hope that it can be broken, that cycle can be broken, that there are things that can be done. And I guess like some of it is a bit of trial and error, much like a lot of psychological processes for treating kind of any kind of mental difficulty, that it is kind of down to the person, and it's really finding a very personal approach that's going to work for that person. So yeah, something that works for one person might be totally useless for another. I am hopeful that there is a way of breaking the cycle. And I think for me, a massive starting point in it is even being able to draw out the cycle with the person that's going through it. You know, like let's sit and write down all the emotions that you're experiencing, and how is that affecting the way you feel physically? How is that affecting the way you feel emotionally? And how is that contributing to any behaviors that you're having? And even like having that initial awareness for some people might be enough. It'd definitely be helpful for coaches. So yeah, even though I don't have like an answer, I wish I did, but I guess I am hopeful is what I can say to that.
In the experience of those, you're talking about backward skills, does it boil down to fear?
It seems to boil down to fear eventually, and a lot of them would, and again, that's why I keep kind of reverting back to what they have naturally learned at a young age, that they will then go and be able to perform the skill, all the, you know, go back, take it back to prep stage, build it back up, and the minute it's at full speed again, the trigger goes again.
Yeah.
And it's like, we never do anything fast really backwards. So why would that feel like a normal thing, you know, for any of us to do? I'm not surprised. And I think it's that, you know, it just then grows arms and legs.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how quick you try and get in with it. And you make a little bit of progress. By that time, you know, that gymnast that was at the same level has now been kind of overtaken. And then you've got that sideways shunt, which puts that gymnast feeling a bit lower. And it's trying to keep them propped up that it's okay. And that's what I'm saying. It's almost like you miss the boat. And the minute it kicks in as a coach, you just think, oh no, because it is really difficult to get that back. And in time for everything that gymnast actually wanted to achieve. And I suppose it's going back to, you know, what you desire, what they desire as a gymnast to achieve. And if they're not hitting that kind of target, they're so hard on themselves. And it just has a absolute knock-on effect that it's really difficult to break, because we're a competitive sport. you know, and at the end of the day, we're quite critical, and that's just part of it. And I appreciate what you said earlier about, you know, positive parenting and things. And a lot of that, yeah, you know, there's lots of there's so many factors that it blows my head, you know, and I would be great if you could just give me an answer that, you know, how do I appreciate it, but no,
that's a $1 million question.
Yeah, it seems to come in that, and like you said, if on the build up to competition, I'm thinking of one in particular, you know, we've had a couple over the years, and that's why I'm really interested in how we stop seeing this, and it does seem to be backward stuff. One gymnast in particular, you know, coming up to competition, and it went, and it had been absolutely fine, and there was no reason for there to be a fear factor, because they'd never fallen, they'd never hurt themselves, they'd never seen anybody else fall. So why was it a fear thing? I think it was just like a, you know, because it was coming up, there was that one extra bit of stress trigger that just slammed some brake on in their head, and they reverted back to what they felt comfortable with. And backwards was not comfy. So it just, you know, they could stand there for half an hour knowing that they could do it. And then once that stress level came back down to a normal kind of training, it would build its way back up and it was fine again. But every time it was like an embedded mechanism that we just couldn't penetrate, just, you know, which is frustrating. But
in some ways, I suppose you can think of it, for some people, it's almost like the body is trying to protect itself, that it's like a reaction, a form of, self-protection that the person hasn't tried to do or hasn't like consciously done. But yeah, it could be like an unconscious form of self-protection.
It's I told you we'd be hitting a hot topic. Fiona, you want to come in, and then we'll go to Louise.
Yeah, no, Nikki, that's it's really interesting hearing you know, talk through that, and you know, and even just in these conversations we're exploring, you know, our own minds, we're kind of thinking out loud with some of it. And then Charlotte, how you're saying there that, you know, sometimes it is just that self-protection. I wonder that when we see quite extreme cases of this, or a reoccurring sort of theme with it, how much, Charlotte, do you think that it is actually down to there's something else going on? I don't know if the term's right, but I would use self-sabotage almost to describe it, in the sense that when something else psychologically feels so out of control, that the one thing they can control, you know, will quite often come down to what they're doing in the gym, and that where it's almost manifesting in the gym, we're seeing it as coaches, but actually it's a far more deep-rooted issue, and it's not so much a coaching issue. It's not about the going backwards or the this or the that. It's actually, it's that way of the body basically trying to control something else, because actually there's another issue way out with that needs to be dealt with and uncovered, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. And I suppose even if you think about it in terms of that self-sabotaging, if someone say had like a competition or anything even coming up that they kind of perceived as a challenge, that and then you think about the perfectionistic factors, for example, as well, of them going, oh well, I don't want to go and fail, or am I going to mess up, that almost like the body shutting down to protect itself. Well, if I can't perform these skills and I can't go to that competition, I can't do it anyway, then I'm stopping myself from these potentially hurtful emotions being experienced. So it could be absolutely something like that as well.
Does fight or flight come into it, Charlotte?
It's not something that I've like explicitly seen or kind of looked into, but I would, I guess, like imagine so.
Let's go to Louise for one more question.
Hi, I'm just kind of thinking about more of how we approach it and how you deal with it with your gymnasts. And I know we don't normally have luxury of timing with competitions approaching and things like that, but we deal with a lot of females. Do you think there's a hormonal aspect of when would be best to try and approach a gymnast with a mental block, for example? Because you talked about anxiety levels being one of the triggers, or makes them more predisposed to it. So perhaps to do with their hormonal cycle, is there a point when it might be they're less anxious, there's more of a chance of accessing what they're thinking or where their brain is at with it?
Good question.
Yeah, big question. I also think the research shows that women are kind of more at threat to experiencing like difficulties in terms of how they think their body is being perceived by others as well. So yeah, again, like I don't really know the answer to your question in terms of like if there's a specific time, I guess. And like I said as well, the vast majority of the research in this area has been done on older male golfers. So yeah, there's such a big gap in the research on, you know, like youth athletes, on women, in gymnastics. So yeah, I don't know like the exact like right answer for you, but I guess that kind of experience of going through puberty, going through hormones and stuff like must be potentially a more vulnerable time for them.
Has any work been done on sort of personality profiling? And if there's a common personality style that's susceptible to this?
Only the things that I spoke about with personality is the only the only research that's been done on it. So yeah, very, very little, very, very little. You know what, we could all leave today with a new like research project to go and do. I've got several contributors. We could all write a paper together.
I just wonder if it's you know, we do the sort of physical profiling as part of the pathway. I wonder if we should do something along the lines of personality profiling and then track that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Really
that's
interesting.
something that I'm sure exists in other sports, doesn't it? Like, you know, football, I know basketball, it isn't just your technical and tactical ability, it's your response to challenges, it's your resilience level, it's your personality, your social skill, your ability to work with others, your ability to communicate effectively, all these kind of things. But obviously, I know that gymnastics is very, 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 very young. So I suppose like we're putting even more pressure on young children that, you know, you need to be this finalized product that, you know, it's going to take you years to get to that level. But I think that's what the challenge is with gymnastics. It's like so young, and you expect it to be everything.
Yeah.
But I think there could be some quite early results, certainly in acrobatics, because you move through the age groups and the skill requirement increases with each. So there can be quite an early dropout rate where, let's say, they get to 13 to 19, where it becomes a little bit more difficult. And then, you know, the amount of tops that come in and say, I want to be a base now, when they could be at the peak of their career. However, they find it difficult and want to flight, if you like. You know, that's where I was coming back to, sort of fight or flight. Do they push through that, you know, that resilient trait, or do they get out when the going gets tough? So it wouldn't probably be that long when you think of our age groups, 11 to 16, 12 to 18, 13 to 19. They could move from 11 to 16 to 13 to 19, depending on the age of the bases, within a year, 2 years. And then we might see if there's a correlation between a personality type to you know, drop out, or issues within performance.
And I actually think, yeah, you've got me excited, because I think it's a real opportunity as well to do a longitudinal study, which is where you can like properly determine whether a factor makes something happen or whether it kind of, you know, influences the onset of, whereas research that's not longitudinal, so something that's just taken like a measure in a one-off, you can't properly say whether it's like causational or that it's come after the experience, for example. So yeah, with that would be the opportunity for that longitudinal evidence, which doesn't exist currently. So could be onto something there, Ian.
Let's take one more point, last point, and then we'll let Charlotte move on. from John. John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, it was just to follow up on what Ian said there, just about maybe not necessarily in a recreational environment necessarily, but in more of a performance environment. Also, gymnasts coming in with information of their type of learning style, so or recognizing the different types of learning styles in the different gymnasts, just to facilitate what Ian was mentioning there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's probably a bunch of different information that would be so interesting to get from people, and to see what like kind of changes over time, or what really does show that kind of like this is gonna, or this has the potential to lead to X has the potential to lead to Y. I feel like there's a big opportunity there. So let's see. Okay, so moving away from performance conflict for a little second, going to briefly talk about, and I don't want to keep you here all night, but going to briefly talk about performance harmony, so that other end of the spectrum that I spoke about. And part of the reason for looking at this side of the evidence is because me and my supervisor spoke about it and said, well, to really understand what performance conflict is, you have to know what it's not. So we thought, like, what's the other end of the spectrum, like those peak performances, flow state, optimal experiences, kind of clutch state, things like that. So the idea behind the intervention study that I'm doing this year is to, instead of like trying to stop or remove any of the experiences that's currently happening, is to instead try and activate the emotions that an athlete experience, or emotions, thoughts that athletes experience during performance harmony, to try and move them out of that. So instead of like saying, how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop that from happening? How do we activate this side of it? So that's what I'm hoping to do in my intervention study this year. Again, I'm going to look at kind of similar subtopics within that as well. So research has shown a positive association between mental toughness and performance harmony, suggesting that those who are mentally tough may have enhanced focus, concentration, be more committed to the task at hand, and have confidence in their ability to overcome challenges. So, which I think is quite an important factor, and kind of quite opposite to a lot of the experiences of performance conflict. Mental toughness is having that confidence, viewing challenges as opportunities, commitment to persisting with tasks, and the extent of perceived control the individual has over their life. And similarly with hardiness as well, was shown to have a positive association with performance harmony, indicating that athletes who are hardy are more likely to be invested in their tasks, and have those higher levels of concentration as well. Optimism as well. So thinking positively and expecting good things to happen is unsurprisingly associated with performance harmony, with many athletes stating that having a positive mindset was crucial to allowing them to enter this state. And again, similarly, being resilient was considered key to athletes in being able to maintain their belief in their ability when facing and overcoming adversity. So again, quite like opposite, I suppose, to the performance conflict. Sorry, my mouse keeps disappearing, so just randomly clicking on the screen to see if it'll appear for me. There we go. Perfectionism. So having adaptive levels of perfectionism. So high perfectionistic striving and low or medium perfectionistic concern could increase athletes' performance harmony through their focus on the quality of the activity that they're engaging in, rather than the outcome or the consequences. So rather than that fear of negative evaluation through like imperfection. And they're also able to maintain a more realistic perspective, which helps them to manage and move on from mistakes as well. And I know we've mentioned particularly around females and the changing body appreciation and body functionality appreciation are all positively associated with performance harmony. So when an athlete is able to appreciate their body and the role it plays in being able to successfully perform in their sport, this can also increase their sport confidence. And again, like body appreciation is not something that's been looked at in the flip side of things. So it's not something that's been studied in relation to performance conflict. So yeah, I guess performance harmony kind of side of things has received a lot more of attention in terms of like clutch state, flow state. So yeah, I do think there's lots that we can learn from this side about what is missing from the other side. And in terms of emotions, so research conducting interviews with athletes highlighted the positive emotions experienced during its performance harmony. So some of the most commonly reported emotions were confidence, enjoyment, optimism, motivation, feeling energetic, feeling joy, and having a desire to compete. And athletes mentioned that it was not only having the presence of positive emotions, but having the ability to regulate negative emotions and an absence of negative emotions, which they believed was like one of the most important factors. So yeah, talking about that ability to regulate emotions. So functional emotions aid in generating like appropriate and sufficient levels of effort and energy for the task, whereas dysfunctional emotions could result in an inappropriate or excessive amount of effort and energy for a task. And the emotions which fit into each of these categories will differ for each athlete and is also totally dependent on sport. So I guess, for example, if someone's got a routine, like maybe being a little bit angry can be good if it's quite a, you know, like angry or fierce routine. Whereas anger is often like perceived as a negative emotion, but it can be a negative functional emotion, if that makes sense. And yeah, for example, as well, like excitement, people think is a positive emotion, but if you need to be like super calm, then being too excited can actually be a positive dysfunctional emotion, for example. So I guess as coaches, something that we can do is have conversations with our gymnasts around, you know, if they say to you, oh, I feel scared. What does being scared actually mean to you? Like, what do you think the function of being scared actually is? So yeah, having those conversations as coaches with our gymnasts around what does that emotion actually mean to you that you're feeling, and how does it help or hinder you, and can a little bit of it be helpful, or is a lot of it helpful? What is the right level of that emotion for you? And kind of having that understanding that is very different for each person and for each sport, each discipline, even within gymnastics. And yeah, so performance harmony as well has been associated with low levels of negative dysfunctional emotions and high levels of positive functional emotions. Apologies, I'm trying to find my mouse again. There we go. And yeah, in terms of confidence, I think this is one of the like key factors, which is something that is kind of like, you know, the opposite, I suppose, from what comes from the performance conflict side of things. So yeah, being confident, having sport confidence, and that perceived ability in believing like you've got that perception in your ability to overcome challenges has been detailed as key factors in allowing athletes to experience performance harmony. So being confident allows athletes to kind of trust in their abilities, have the perception of being prepared, and perception of that skill challenge balance. Whereas athletes believe that they possess the skills necessary to complete the challenge, increasing their perception of control over the task. So yeah, like we said before, one of the things that's kind of missing potentially from that performance conflict experience. And confidence may also have protective factors against other emotions, such as anxiety. So athletes that are high in confidence are more likely to interpret their anxiety as being facilitative, so helpful, rather than debilitative to their performance, which I think is quite interesting that it has that protective quality. And yeah, in terms of motivation, again, not something that's been studied in relation to performance conflict, but on the performance harmony side of things, that intrinsic motivation, so being driven by internal rewards such as satisfaction, was shown to be positively associated with performance harmony, whereas amotivation, so having a total lack of motivation, was shown to be negatively associated with performance harmony. So using things like motivational self-talk could allow athletes to feel more confident, regulate their emotions, such as anxiety, and increase their perception of a skill challenge balance. Also, following an experience of performance harmony, athletes reported enhanced intrinsic motivation, feelings of enjoyment, their desire to continuously improve, and an eagerness to perform or to face challenges. So almost like the total opposite effect, that people are actually getting into almost like a thriving cycle at this end of the continuum. And then in terms of thoughts and cognitions, so whilst skill execution remains automatic, it is suggested that during performance harmony experiences, an athlete's psychological state is consciously regulated in order to increase concentration and effort on the task at hand, increasing their sense of control. So their focus and concentration isn't on trying to like control the movement, but instead on like regulating their emotions and staying like focused on the kind of task relevant information. And kind of similar to emotions, athletes reported that it's not only like being optimistic and having positive thoughts, which they think is important, but actually having an absence of negative thoughts, which they believe kind of facilitated the performance harmony experience. And yeah, again, opposite to performance conflict, low perceived pressure and expectations from the athlete on themselves and from others was thought to aid the onset of performance harmony. And the mindset was developed after positive experiences, positive feedback, and following an increase in confidence. So again, that thriving cycle almost. And yeah, finally, again, that important skill challenge balance and perceiving this situation to be a challenge and not a threat. So yeah, quite, you can see like the kind of reoccurring themes, I guess, throughout the performance harmony side of the literature. And then, yeah, finally, in terms of personal growth, and then I promise I'll pause to let you ask any questions on this stuff. The literature indicates that athletes felt that they were able to experience performance harmony following a feeling of overcoming adversity. This could be either within the sporting context. So, for example, like beating someone that they perceive to be of a higher level or more capable than them, or it could be within the athlete's personal life. So again, this feeling of overcoming adversity indicates the importance of the athlete's like skill challenge balance, that although they may have felt they were facing like a high level challenge, they believed that they had the capacity to overcome the challenge. And interestingly as well, being comfortable in their personal life was something that athletes indicated as being important to experiencing performance harmony. So not necessarily relevant to children, but things like not worrying about money, having like good relationships and experiences with family helped athletes feel more comfortable in their competitive environment, allowing for the experience of performance harmony. So apologies, I feel like I flew through that quite fast, but just wanted to make sure that I wasn't keeping you all night and that we had time for the last couple of bits. So before I move on to the wee last part, almost done, I promise. Does anyone have any questions on the performance harmony side of things?
I think all of that you've just covered there sort of comes down to personality. You know, somebody who's competitive, wants to win, wants to beat people, will work hard to do that, rather than a perfectionist. You know, when I hear that word now from a parent, oh yeah, she's a perfectionist, the alarm bells ring straight away. Whereas I'd rather have, and I'd be interested to know, certainly Nikki, if you've experienced this in the past, where we've had someone super talented, I'd rather have someone who was super hardworking. Does that make sense?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah. From past experience, we see a bigger drop off in gymnasts that come in that are naturally talented,
Yeah,
than the ones that come in that aren't as good, but they work for everything that they gain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the ones that come in naturally talented, my view is that the minute things get a little bit tough, they've actually gained no tools through life because everything's come easy. They've never worked through, and the minute it gets tough, that's them off.
Yeah.
The ones that work for, aren't naturally talented, have learned to work with it, use tools that they acquire along the way, stay in the sport far longer, and even right through into, when I look at the coaching team I work with, the coaching team are absolutely amazing, have much more knowledge than I do, which is great. But they're the gymnasts that weren't the best gymnasts in the world. They just were hard workers and worked their way through and stuck with it. And that's what, I see from our side of things, that the ones that are naturally talented actually don't have the tools to work themselves through tough situations. It gets too much and they walk away because that's how they deal with that situation.
Yeah.
Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was just interested in what the differentiation was between a gymnast with natural talent versus one that was hardworking.
That's a good. I was thinking that myself. Like that's a good debate, isn't it? Does that exist? Natural talent.
So for me, you could have a gymnast that could come in to your gym at a young age, can do always splits, springy, has good strength to weight ratio. You could get another gymnast who comes in, is stiffer, but has that work ethic to work harder than that talented gymnast, in terms of basic skills, fundamentals, to overcome the lack of natural ability. And like Nikki says, 9 times out of 10, I would see them going further and staying longer in the sport.
Has that person with natural talent acquired the skills sooner in their own way rather than being, I'm going to use the word forced, but I don't mean it forced in a gymnastic environment? I'm just interested.
No, I think they just possess the fundamental physical traits.
Physical, right? Okay.
From a young age to be able to perform well at a young age. But when the hard work comes in, and like Nikki says, because they've not been used to working hard to develop the skills, the natural traits.
It's just that it almost contradicts what we were talking about earlier about, see that, where we're talking about going backwards. So if someone comes in with natural skill, i.e. let's say they've learned to move backwards early in their life and they're quite comfortable doing it. Do you see what I mean? Like it's almost a conflict of what we're saying there. Like,
no,
we're talking about natural skill, but
sorry, when it was two kind of different things. So the backward stuff, I have never seen any difference with those that have bounced about on the trampoline or garden, and learned it themselves or have been taught it in the gym. So that's kind of like a separate thing. What I was talking about here, with not only those that are like naturally talented, so come in the door and from the age of 3 they can touch their toes and they can pull an effort at a chin on a bar or something. It's just naturally there. They stay longer in the sport, but not just when it starts getting hard, as in hard work. The harder the skill gets and the more complex the skill gets, because they've learned these basic fundamentals quite naturally. Like I'm completely, it's kind of completely separate for me. The backward stuff was a different subject, if that makes sense to what I was kind of getting at with this one.
Okay, thanks.
And I think just to add to that, with the natural, if natural versus the hard worker, when they come up against an obstacle such as going backwards, if it doesn't come natural to both of them, my money would be on the hard worker overcoming that before the talented one. Through natural determination and drive and intrinsic motivation.
How do we put, so if performance harmony is where we want to get to for every athlete, right? How do we empower coaches to be able to implement that within their practice? Do you know what I mean? Like for all the athletes, regardless if you're talented or not.
Then it boils down to understanding the individual and at what level they can achieve performance harmony. Because if it can't be achieved at junior, senior, then it needs to be achieved lower down.
Mm.
And at the point where it can't be achieved, that's when, certainly in acrobatics, there needs to be a change of partnerships, change of personnel. Would you agree, Charlotte?
Yeah, I was going to say, just to add to that, I think, yeah, it's exactly what you said in terms of it being so individual, which again is what makes it difficult. And yeah, there's things that we can, as coaches, try and understand about our gymnasts in terms of, you know, like I was saying, that those kind of like ideal emotions that they experience, or knowing that that's going to be different for each gymnast. And can we take the time, or I know coaching's so busy, but do we have the time to kind of try and figure out with each gymnast what their kind of optimal emotional or optimal arousal experience is? Or, you know, like I said, sitting with your gymnast and writing down, like drawing out the vicious cycle that they're stuck in, like sit and draw with them. What does a thriving cycle look like to you? What are the positive emotions or thoughts, or, you know, what are all the things that you would experience if you were thriving? And yeah, kind of having them figure out as well for themselves, as well as kind of giving that understanding to you, what that would look like for them. Because yeah, it will be very individual as well.
Yeah, that's great, because I'm actually, you're getting me to reflect on my own experience from a coach, and albeit I'm a different sport from you guys, but when I'm reflecting my experience as a coach, I don't reflect back on how I tackled the personal growth of my athletes. I always go back, have I helped them technically? Have I helped them tactically? Have I helped them, you know, fit within the team and win games and stuff? But like, I wish I had known that before. So I suppose, like, you know, you learn every day, and I'm glad to be here. But it's like, if I were to do that again, I would go, right, okay, it's about tracking and recording with my athletes their progress in regards to their ability to, you know, be more resilient, their ability to increase their mental toughness. I would actually implement that within my day-to-day practice and plan for it, as well as the technical and tactical stuff. So, yeah, that's quite insightful.
Yeah, no, amazing. And like you said as well, I think in sport, we're so good at kind of noticing, like, what are the things that need to be improved on? Like, how can we do that better? Because we're always pushing to be better. You know, that's the nature of sport. And like you said, sometimes it's taking time to remember, like, what are the super strengths that each athlete possesses? What is the strength within this team or this partnership? Or what are the kind of things that make them thrive, as well as the things to help them improve? So yeah, that was a nice insight. Thank you. Yeah, any other comments, or are you happy for me to move on?
Charlotte, could I say one more thing?
Go for it.
Just when you mentioned about gymnasts being scared, and you mentioned about coaches asking them, what does this mean? I think maybe coaches need to be a bit careful with that comment. So rather than in a sort of being perceived in negative, or what does that mean, rather than what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
And I think coaches probably need to be careful not maybe to give their opinion after that comment, like just because of the negative impacts that it may cause on the gymnast, you know, like I think that was one thing. And just the other thing you mentioned about at this point, I might state the obvious here, but I think probably what you're saying is that we probably need to tell coaches that it's likely not their failings as a coach that gymnasts develop sort of blocks, etc. But I do wonder how gymnasts and parents perceive this, because I've certainly seen gymnasts change clubs because of a block, and actually still have the same block, having gone to several clubs. So I think just my thought there was, I think it's important just to, in a lot of cases, it's not a coaching failure, is it? I'm right in saying that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you're so right in terms of, absolutely, we have to be careful with the way we word things to the gymnasts. And like you said, adding that, like, what does that mean to you is important. And actually have a slide, my final slide is actually in terms of the way we react as coaches, and how as coaches, like, we're very much kind of role models. And I can talk about it now, actually, but in terms of reflecting on yourself as a coach, and I need to do this as well, but even kind of thinking about your own personality characteristics or your own kind of levels of perfectionism, and, how do you deal with failure, or how do you, yourself, or how do you deal with challenges, and how do you display that to your gymnast? If your gymnast has had a struggle, how do you deal with that emotion yourself and stuff? For example, how do you regulate your own emotions? So yeah, coaching is a tough job. I've actually just been writing an assignment on coaches not having their own personal needs met, which is why I added a little slide on this, because I thought it was so fascinating. But the kind of position that we have as role models, and taking the time to kind of be very aware of yourself, your own personality characteristics, your own traits that you might kind of just do it without even realizing, because that's just who you are. But taking time to kind of know yourself as well, and how you react to those things, and how unconsciously that might come across your gymnasts. So a very interesting point.
Ian, just a question for you, actually. How important is the role of a coach in setting, because what we're talking about here essentially is the environment that we want to nurture the athlete, because the environment will help towards the growth of the athlete. How important is the role of a coach for you in your experience, and that sort of setting the tone for the environment and setting the culture of how we deal with challenges, how we deal with resilience? Because like you say, Charlotte, that you have to be quite self-reflective as a coach and self-aware, I suppose, don't you?
Yeah, I think as coaches, you get somebody talented through the door, you've got to nurture them. You've got to have them working at the right level for their age, not be tempted to push them on too early because of the talent. I think as a coach, we can create the right environment through our coaching style. Like we said, we're talking about how we communicate with the gymnasts. I think we can have a role in a contribution towards lost move syndrome if skills aren't coached in the right manner, given the right amount of time, shortcuts taken. Like I say, going back to our former national coach, Bulgarian, if the skill was never found in the first place, then it could be lost a lot easier. So in other words, if we take too many shortcuts to coach a skill, then there's far more elements of that skill that can break down. So I think nurturing coaching skills appropriately with the right progressions, not pushing gymnasts too early to perform skills that are maybe within their skill set eventually, but not within their level of maturity at that time. So I do think, looking back to my situation that I had, I've got to self-reflect and say, did I contribute by doing this, and this, and pushing too early, or was it inherent in a personality trait? So I think it's a hugely important trait of a coach to self-reflect regularly and analyze what they're doing and nurture and coach the skill thoroughly with all the right progressions and foundations.
I would totally agree with you on that, Ian. I think that there are probably elements as coaches where you can maybe potentially put gymnasts at risk of developing like lost move or performance conflict, but there could also be times where we've done everything in our power and it's something within their kind of like personality or their individual kind of differences that causes it. So there's no, like we said, there's no kind of like right or wrong, and it's probably each individual's experience. But I think potentially, I guess for some people where it hasn't been like anything to do with the coach, that maybe they're, you know, like you were saying before about gymnast moving clubs and stuff, that, you know, that not wanting to take like responsibility or accountability for the situation and feeling the need to blame other people. I'm just speculating, but sorry, I'm just waffling now.
No, I think that is relevant. I think, you know, we've got to do everything we can in nurturing a gymnast to try to avoid that situation as a coach, but it may still arise.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to whiz through the last couple of slides, and then if anyone's got any more comments after that, I'll come back to those. So what can we do to help? I know we've touched on a few of these things already and said, you know, some of them help and some of them don't, but very briefly. So unfortunately, there isn't a set like kind of cure or fix for performance conflict, probably because of how individual the experience is. But a couple of suggestions that I have, like we said before, working with psychological support, whether that be kind of like specific therapy for trauma or, you know, psychological skills training. As much as we can as coaches, providing athletes with evidence and opportunities for competence to increase their confidence. Working with your athletes, potentially having a sports psychologist on emotional regulation, attentional regulation, and how you manage negative or unhelpful thoughts. And reducing the emphasis on outcome goals and focusing more on the process or quality of training and performance to hopefully reduce like perceived pressure and expectations. And exactly what Ian was saying there, trying to create that supportive environment as much as we can, so that we're doing what we can as coaches to kind of prevent it in terms of from our side of things. And I just wanted to like briefly mention this because, like I said, I've been writing an assignment on coaches not having their own needs met. And so I was running a mini intervention with a couple of coaches on the use of self-compassion and how it can hopefully help coaches personally and hopefully professionally as well, because there's no research on how like coaches' self-compassion helps gymnasts or athletes, but there's research that teammates being more self-compassionate can benefit individuals within teams that aren't self-compassionate. So I just wanted to briefly mention it because I thought that when I was reading about it, there were so many things I thought like, oh, that could surely help, like performance conflict. And I'm actually going to include an element of self-compassion in my intervention as well. So just very, very briefly, self-compassion is giving yourself care, compassion, understanding and acceptance during challenging times rather than being critical or judgmental. So self-compassion also involves acknowledging that you're not alone or isolated in your experiences and that other people have had similar experiences. And self-compassion also involves a mindful element, so kind of like a balance between thoughts and feelings rather than either overly engaging in them or suppressing them. There's loads of benefits for self-compassion. It can help with, like, as a coping strategy, it can be an opportunity for growth and for development, can increase like happiness, optimism, well-being, and it has also been shown for athletes to help cope with difficult times. So those times of like significant emotional experiences, like we were saying. And it's also negatively related to self-criticism, depression, anxiety, rumination, perfectionism, shame, fear of failure, fear of negative evaluation, fear of negative body evaluation, and isolation. So this is why I was reading it going like, oh my goodness, like surely this is something that should benefit or hopefully help with performance conflict, because like it says in there, you know, negatively related to a bunch of perfectionistic traits and, you know, like negative body evaluation, isolation, all things that come up in performance conflict. So yeah, if anyone's interested on that, I've got like a little self-compassion task. It's like a 5-day thing, but if anyone's interested, just give me a shout and I can send that on to you. But yeah, I thought I'd throw that in there because I thought it was really interesting. And I also wanted to quickly put this in here for you, Ian, because I know last time you spoke about, you know, like on the 4th, 5th day of training, that sometimes you notice like the fatigue and mental fatigue in gymnasts. So I put this one in for you. So yeah, sport is an activity which is high in cognitive demand. So having adequate mental rest between sessions can promote better skill learning, because basically if we're just always in high cognitive demand, we reach a saturation point where we can no longer process the information we're receiving, and we can't like consolidate it into our memory effectively. So yeah, we don't want to always be at that kind of like high cognitive demand. So a couple of ways that we can help promote mental rest are things like sleep. I think that's something that is particularly challenging for teenagers. And the research with regard to teenagers is, you know, that is an element for them that can be quite difficult, particularly with their bodies changing and their hormones changing. Their sleep cycle naturally changes, which doesn't fit with the natural school cycle and stuff as well. So that's a whole different ballgame. Having a break from thinking about sport completely can be really beneficial for giving adequate mental rest time. So having like alternative hobbies and things, friends out with sport, so that there's no sport related kind of cues within their environment. That's really important. Having an active break from effortful thinking, so low cognitive demand activities. So even things like watching TV. I know people that are high achievers often have difficulty with doing stuff like that because they feel like guilty, like they should be doing something. But I try and tell people that actually watching TV is serving a purpose, and that it's giving your brain time to rest. So it does actually have a function. And just watching TV is just an example, but could be something like that. Also being able to kind of have like a bit of balance in life, so not feeling like they're being controlled by their sport, making sure that they actively schedule in time for themselves at some point. Variation in their routine, so especially I guess with kids, like days can become quite monotonous, so it's even just doing tiny things that change their routine slightly can be good for mental rest. And that can even be like walking a different route home from school or driving a different way to work, for example. And this applies to coaches as well, because I'm sure there's time when coaches definitely need mental rest as well. Also having time for important other tasks out with sport is important as well. So time for studies. And yeah, again, like having time for a life out with sport. So friends out with the sporting environment as well. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention that because I hadn't forgotten that you spoke about it last time as well, Ian.
Yeah, because we train Monday through to Saturday, and generally we were finding by around Thursday there was quite a bit of mental fatigue, tears amongst the younger ones. So we changed the intensity of the training sessions accordingly, and sort of a little more intense Monday through to Wednesday, slightly easier Thursday, Friday, and then last session Saturday more intense because there was a day off following. And just to be mindful of that, because there was an obvious pattern. And so once we recognized that quite quickly, we did make those changes to change that intensity come Thursday, Friday, because obviously otherwise you keep pushing through and then you've got burnout, which can lead to the issues we've talked about.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it was such an interesting point that you raised the last time about it, which is why I had to put it in here, because I think we're quite good at knowing when we need to take physical rest, but really not good at knowing when we need to take mental rest. And yeah, like you said, you know, knowing that if by the fifth day of training, that processing of information has become saturated or become slower, that without even knowing it, potentially that's affecting skill development, for example. And there's no research linking the two, but after you mentioned it and after I'd like read this study, I was like, it feels like it fits. So yeah. And then a final thing as well, which I know I kind of briefly mentioned before, was just remembering our kind of role as coaches, as role models, and not to put any more pressure or expectations on your shoulders, because like I said, I was just reading a bunch of stuff about coaches not having their own needs met because we're so busy looking after everyone else. But like taking time to kind of be aware of yourself, your own personality, your own perfectionism, your own ability to cope with challenges, and how that influences your kind of reaction to your gymnasts or to your environment. And even asking yourself questions like, do you ever take time for mental rest? You know, are you demonstrating those skills to your gymnasts? And I even put like self-compassion. Do we ever kind of take time to be compassionate to ourselves as coaches? Because like I said, that research showed that teammates being more self-compassionate made the individuals in that team that weren't as self-compassionate more self-compassionate. So surely if we demonstrate that as a coach, we can create that environment within our gymnasts. And like I said, if anyone's interested in that 5-day self-compassion task, just give me a shout and I can send it over. It's not a problem at all. Apologies, I've gone a little bit over time, and I know it's quite information heavy, but thank you so much for all your insight, your comments, your questions. It's been interesting for me, actually, and there's lots of stuff that it's got me thinking about as well. And like I said, if anyone who knows a gymnast is currently experiencing performance conflict that's over the age of 16, I'm looking for a participant in my study, so just give me a shout. My email is on these slides, and I'm more than happy for you to pass out my email as well to everyone after this too.